All right, I'm Peter Gagnon from the National Renewable Energy Lab, and me and my colleague on FAM are here to give an overview of the 2023 release of NREL standard scenarios, and then have a question and answer at the end. Right, so what we are going to do is we're going to start off talking about what are the standard scenarios. We're going to talk about what the scenario suite is this year. Talk about some of the major modeling and data changes from last year's edition of the standard scenarios. And then we'll spend a bunch of time on some highlights from the results, and then end with a question and answers session. So if you'll note, I believe on the bottom of the screen, there is a little Q&A box that you can click. Please go ahead and submit any questions that you have as we go along into that Q&A box, and then either we'll answer some as we go along, or we'll discuss them at the end, the ones we can get to. The mics and cameras will be muted for the duration of the webinar, but we'll do the Q&A through that box. The webinar is being recorded and it will be made available later in the week. So with that being said, let's get started. So what are the standard scenarios? So this is the 9th edition. This is an annual effort. We do an annual projection of the possible future of the US electricity sector across a wide range of possible futures. And what we do is we take a bunch of data, both data about the current state of the electric grid, as well as projections of possible future inputs or things that drive change in the electricity sector. So there's things from the EIA, the Energy Information Agency, that a lot of data about what the current composition of the grid is, as well as projections of things like fuel prices. We draw from NREL's annual technology baseline for projections of technology costs and performance. How much does it cost to build stuff, and what is the performance characteristics of different technologies? And there's NREL's REV model, which produces really high-resolution, site-specific characteristics of renewable energy resources across the United States, including things like interconnection costs. Was it cost to upgrade lines to get load from different sites to load centers, things like that. So a lot of detailed information about like wind and solar availability across multiple years of historical weather data. A lot of good data there, and as well as connecting other models like DGen, which is a model that we use to project the adoption of behind-the-meter distributed solar assets. All that's fed into the REEDS model, which is a capacity expansion model. It solves for the least cost building and operation of the electric grid over time, subject to policy and operational constraints. So anytime that we're showing and talking about projection, it's the least cost solution subject to policy and operational constraints. Policy being things like enacted legislation about renewable portfolio standards at the state level are in the model, and operational constraints are things like you have to have a reserve margin, there's ancillary services that you have to acquire, load has to meet demand, things like that. And then from REEDS, we get this mixture, which is what gets built and how is it operated. And those are the kind of things that we'll be looking at today and what's in the report and the data that you can download. There are 3 different main ways that you can engage with get the data and the narrative from the standard scenarios. So there's a report that gives a lot of the narrative explanation of what we're seeing in the scenarios, talks a little bit about the highlights. There is also a scenario viewer and data downloader, where you can go and actually kind of interact with some of the data through an interactive viewer, as well as download CSVs that have the projection, the data that we're going to be looking at today. And then lastly, there is an associated product, the Cambium databases that we put out annually that have, for a subset of the scenarios, not all of them, a subset of the scenarios, we produce more metrics at an hourly resolution. So there's a lot of additional data in those select subset of scenarios. That's not out yet. The leg's a little bit behind, but it'll be coming out. The edition associated with this year's 10 scenarios will be coming out soon. So keep an eye out for that if you are interested in more detailed data about things like marginal emission rates and stuff for the future of the power sector, US electric sector. Okay, that's what the standard scenarios is. Now we're going to talk a little bit about what this year's scenario suite is. So as usual, we have a central set of assumptions. We call them, there's the mid case is kind of our business as usual central estimates for a variety of inputs, mid case assumptions. So that's central estimates for things like technology costs, fuel prices, resource availability, things of that nature. There's also kind of a moderate, again, central estimate of demand growth, assumes moderate electrification. And then we have existing policies as enacted in September of 2023 when we were kicking off these scenarios. So that's things like state level enacted portfolio standards, things like that. So that's our mid-case central set of assumptions. We have that run, and then we do a bunch of sensitivities off of that run where we will vary certain key inputs. There's things like generator cost and performance. We have advanced and conservative renewable energy and battery cost and performance. Nuclear, advanced and conservative, CCS cost and performance. We also have sensitivities that vary the amount of electricity demand in the future. There's low demand growth and high demand growth. But then there's also new to this year are two scenarios that layer on what we're calling here a hydrogen economy. And what we mean by that is that we are putting into the model the endogenous production of hydrogen through low temperature electrolysis. So that's energy consuming electrolyzers producing hydrogen for non-power sector uses. We force the model to produce a significant amount of hydrogen for a trajectory that is aligned with estimates of what could be consumed for full economy-wide decarbonization for other sectors, not just the power sector. So a significant amount of hydrogen load in those scenarios. One key caveat is that for those folks following the hydrogen discussion is that when we ran this modeling, the 45V IRA production tax credit definition was not defined by Treasury yet, so we do not have that represented in the model. That's just a key thing to understand. Any hydrogen represented here does not represent the production tax credit of the IRA, which is rather significant. That'll be coming out in future modeling. Back to sensitivities. The other ones are fuel prices, low and high natural gas. We have set a sensitivity where we extend all of the IRA tax credits indefinitely throughout the modeling horizon. And then some other kind of miscellaneous categories, ones where we turn off for investment currently nascent technologies, reduce the amount of RE, renewable energy that's available, have one where DC macrogrid is available for investment, another one that constrains transmission investment, and another one where we turn on the option to invest in electricity powered direct air capture, which is normally off in the model, except for that sensitivity. So we take those sensitivities, and then we run each of them for three different electricity sector CO2 emissions trajectories or assumptions. There's one just called current policies, which just has, as you would intuit, the policies as currently enacted at the state and federal level, nothing added on. But then we have additionally, we run each sensitivity over two different emissions reduction trajectories, one a 95% CO2 reduction by 2050, and another more aggressive one that's 100% CO2 reduction by 2035. So we end up with 53 different scenarios out of this. Major changes from the last year's edition of the standard scenarios. There's a lot of them, they're documented in the report, but these are just kind of the high level ones, or the most impactful ones. First, we have new demand projections. They both have higher levels of demand as well as changing patterns of demand. There's more winter peaking going on because of assumptions about electrification that we didn't have in the prior edition. You can see here that we have these 5 different demand trajectories, and some of them, the ones that have high electrification and or high this hydrogen economy, the end-use demand growth can be really quite significant. This blue line here is our reference assumption, which is in most scenarios, except for the sensitivities that state something different. So new demand projections that tend to be higher than in previous years. Another big change is that now we do have the endogenous production of hydrogen through low temperature electrolysis within the model. So it's when hydrogen is being used in the model in combustion turbines, it is also being produced by the model through low temperature electrolysis, adding load. We have added in additional types of interconnection costs for generators that mostly impacts renewable energy generators. Specifically, we have network reinforcement costs, which are costs to make it so that you can estimates the costs to enhance the transmission grid to bring power from renewable energy sites to load centers that was not previously in the model. We also have things like growth penalties and relying on some EIA data for near-term projected builds that we didn't have before that are just trying to improve the model's near-term projections, which is difficult because this is a time of rapid change in the power sector. And then we also have, this is more of the wonky modeling side, but we do have significant improvements in the temporal resolution of the underlying Reed's model that just allows us to better capture some of the temporal aspects of how these technologies are interacting. Okay, thanks for hanging in there. That was all the setup. Now we're going to turn to highlights from this year's standard scenario suite. So I'm going to start. I'm going to dwell a fair amount of time on this image. This is the results for the mid case. So this is central estimates for all the inputs that we're putting into the model under current policies, not the decarbonization things, just current policies as enacted. And this is showing the results from 2022 through 2050 for, on the left, we have the generation mixture for the United States over time. And then on the right, we have the capacity mixture. So this is the gigawatts, on the left is the terawatt hours of what's being built and how it's being operated in our central estimate. There's a lot of sensitivities off of this, but we're going to talk through this to kind of get an idea of what the central estimate of the future looks like according to Reed's. So I'm going to walk through the different technologies here one by one and talk a little bit about what we're seeing. So starting at the bottom, we have in red, we have nuclear. So you can see here that there's a little bit of a decline. There is some economic retirements occurring in the model, but for the most part, we see the nuclear fleet sticking around and remaining. The generation contribution of the nuclear fleet remains fairly steady in the central projection of the U.S. electric grid in our modeling. The next technology here, this black, is coal. So you can see that it starts off at a fairly high energy generation contribution, and then it declines pretty materially through the 2020s to the point where by 2030 the energy contribution for coal is quite low, and then it kind of further declines to a very low contribution by 2050. Most of that's just economic retirement. The next technology here, this blue chunk, is natural gas. It's a little bit hard to tell, but there is a little bit of a generation decrease in the near term, and then it kind of comes back a little bit and ends at kind of a similar level where it started by 2050. That's generation. The capacity, the amount of natural gas combined cycle capacity that the model is seeing doesn't decline at any point. The model just kind of steadily adds to that over time and uses that different capacity resource. It's a similar story for this kind of thin light purple line. That is natural gas combustion turbines. That's more of a peaking asset, and you can just see that it has a similar story as natural gas combined cycle, in that it contributes throughout this central estimate of the future of the grid. We have a handful of technologies here that I'm not going to talk too much about. Hydro, imports from Canada, geothermal, biopower. They're all there. They expand a little bit, but for the most part, there's not a huge expansion of those technologies in the projection, in this central projection. And then the big movement that's happening is in the blue and the yellow. The blue is wind, the yellow is solar. The light blue is onshore wind, the dark blue is offshore wind. And then the darker yellow is utility scale solar, and the lighter yellow is behind the meter solar. So you can see here, of course, that on an energy, well, both energy and capacity, we're building lots of wind and solar in this projection of the future. It's cheap, and the Inflation Reduction Act incentives for clean generation makes it so that the model ends up deploying a great deal of wind and solar very rapidly in the near term, but steadily over time as well. And then the last thing that I skipped over, but I'll come back to now, is that there are a bunch of currently nascent technologies, things like nuclear small modular reactors, coal and gas with carbon capture and storage, bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, and hydrogen combustion turbines. All of these do show up now in our mid case. Some of them, like nukes and hydrogen, are in very small amounts in states that have 100% decarbonization policies, and they're supporting the achievement of those policies. The ones like the CCS technologies show up in other places, mostly induced by the 45Q rather significant tax credit for capturing and storing carbon, which does induce the deployment of CCS technologies in this in our central estimate of the future. So spend a lot of time on that. That's kind of our central projection. And then everything from that we're looking at later is all adding on, the decarbonization policies or sensitivities on top of this, seeing how that build out changes. Oh, forgive me, I forget to point out that on the right here in capacity, we do see the storage build out up here on the top, so you can see storage continues to grow in large part to take advantage of it's in conjunction with the deployment of variable renewable technologies. We get a fair amount of storage in these features, as one would expect. Okay, what I'm going to do here now is take a moment to compare the mid case. So this top image is what I just spent all that time talking about, same image on the top. And on the bottom is last year's mid case. And I want to just point out a major difference from last year's mid case. And that major difference is that last year, you can see down here, is that we had this rebound in the 2040s of fossil technologies, a lot of a rebound of natural gas. The reason why we saw that last year, but do not see it this year, is that the Inflation Reduction Act has significant tax credits for clean generation. Those tax credits are scheduled to expire, phase out, either in 2032 or when the U.S. electric grid goes lower than 25% greenhouse gas emissions relative to 2022 levels. If whichever one of those two things occurs later. What that means is if you never pass that threshold, the tax credits never expire. Last year, we saw the threshold be passed, so the tax credits expired, and you saw this rebound. This year, we do not see that threshold pass. Therefore, the tax credits in IRA do not expire, and we just see them persist over time through the end of the modeling horizon in most of the scenarios. Not all, some pass that threshold, but most of the scenarios with current policies do not pass that threshold. So we don't see that rebound. Talk a little bit more about that in some later figures. So that's a big difference between this year and last year. Okay, another thing that I'm going to compare, again, on the top, we have the figure that we've been looking at, the current policies mid case. On the bottom here, we have the mid case, so all the same assumptions about fuel prices, technology costs, etc. The only difference is that the bottom figure is showing the results where if we apply a constraint to the model to decarbonize 100% net by 2035, what does the model solve for that least cost solution for that requirement in that potential future? So the main thing here that you can see is that the contribution of fossil technologies is materially different. Before, we just had kind of uncontrolled natural gas persisting for a while. A lot of that, the uncontrolled natural gas stays. There is still uncontrolled natural gas contributing even in this 100% decarbonization scenario, but it's being operated at very low capacity factors, primarily as a firm capacity peaking resource. There's also a lot of CCS retrofits occurring to, again, serve that kind of firm capacity role in this 100% scenario. There's also a lot of, or there's more, I don't know if you'd call this a lot, but this green chunk here is hydrogen combustion turbines, which get deployed a lot more materially in the 100% decarbonization scenario, as opposed to the very, very teeny sliver that it was in the mid case. One thing just to clarify is that, of course, how do you have fossil, even CCS, in a 100% decarbonization scenario? That's happening because of the presence of bioenergy with carbon capture, which we represent in this model as a negative emissions technology. So the model reads is the solution that it's finding is that it's cheaper to build bioenergy with carbon capture, a net negative emissions technology, which is tends to be an expensive technology to build out in any material quantities, but it builds out some as negative emissions technology to then give room for fossil as a peaking resource. This is what the model is identifying as the least cost solution. So it'd prefer to have this negative emissions technology and retain some of this fossil capacity for peaking resources, rather than retiring that fossil and just going to full clean generation, seeing that as a cheaper option, which is the optimization that's happening here. So that's what we're seeing in the 100% decarbonization scenario mid case. So that was the mid case. What I'm going to show here and spend a little time going over is the generation trends, and we have some other, we'll look at other metrics after this, but we're going to focus first on generation contribution by technology across the full suite of all 53 scenarios. So each of these panels are the different technologies. Like up here, we'll start, natural gas is this panel here. This is the generation contribution of natural gas across the 53 scenarios from 2022 to 2050. And the lines here, the yellow lines are the current policy scenarios, so no decarbonization. The green lines are the 95% decarbonization by 2050 scenario, and the blue lines are the 100% decarbonization by 2035 scenarios. The heavier dashed lines are the mid case in each of the three different emissions scenarios. So I'm going to step through each of these panels because there's a lot going on here. So first, looking at wind and solar, as we saw in the mid case, wind and solar, a lot getting built here. And there's also a lot of a significant range. I mean, this is a pretty big range of possible wind builds by 2050. The main driver of wind and solar builds, the main driver of the variation there is the demand growth. The highest scenarios are the ones where you're having to build immense amount of resources to serve high electrification and hydrogen production and all that kind of stuff. And the lowest ones tend to be the low demand growth scenarios. Other things are, of course, important, like the cost of renewable energy technologies are the second most impactful driver of wind and solar deployment. But the the demand growth is the biggest driver there. But across all the scenarios, lots of wind and solar deployment. Next thing to look at is uncontrolled fossil, natural gas and coal. It's similar trends to what we saw in the mid-case versions of this, which is that in current policies, we tend to see the natural gas contribution kind of dip, but then rebound to approximately current levels. There are scenarios where it does decline materially, and it declines uncontrolled. Natural gas does decline. Energy contribution does decline fairly materially in the 100% decarbonization scenario, but again, does not go away completely because of the presence of negative emissions technologies. I do want to point out that the decline in the 100% scenario is partially because of a lot of retrofitting into CCS. So it's not necessarily retiring these units, it's retrofitting them with carbon capture options. Coal, across all scenarios, there is this decline in the 2020s, and then either it kind of goes away entirely or stays at low levels throughout. That's fairly constant across the scenario suite. Next thing I'll call out here is the carbon capture and storage technologies, natural gas, coal, and biopower, and just pointing out that the highest levels for all three technologies do occur, as one would expect in the 100% decarbonization scenario. Natural gas, CCS, energy contribution can get quite material in the 100% decarbonization scenarios. If there isn't a decarbonization constraint or constraint on the model, then it does tend to be deployed, but the levels are not significant compared to other technology deployments. But it is there. Coal pops up when 45Q is available, but then tends to decline, either go away entirely or just be operated at a low capacity factor when the 45Q credit expires for the generators that were built to capture it. And then biopower as CCS shows up in most scenarios at a higher level in the decarbonization ones. And then the last thing I'll just point out quick is hydropower, geothermal, fairly constant. Geothermal, we do see some builds in the low renewable energy costs if we assume high performance and low costs for geothermal amongst other technologies. We do see more of it being built, but otherwise it's kind of a fairly low growth for that technology based off of the current cost and performance assumptions that we're seeing. And then hydrogen, always quite low compared to other technologies in a generation contribution, but you can see that there is more. It does play a greater role in the decarbonization scenarios. So this was energy. Energy is not the only thing we care about. So I'm going to look at a similar plot breaking out across the scenario suite by technology, but now we're going to look at firm capacity, not energy contribution, but how much are you contributing to the grid meeting demand at the most difficult or stressful times of the year for the grid. So I'm going to step through the different technologies here, like I did with the generation. So first of all, firm capacity, natural gas, you can see that in all scenarios, uncontrolled natural gas plays a pretty material role in providing firm capacity. Even in the 100% scenarios, again, there's this dip as things get retrofitted, but uncontrolled natural gas still ends up hanging around and playing a firm capacity role in the future of the grid as we're modeling it. Next technologies, wind and solar. We build a ton, but of course it cannibalizes its own ability to, or it cannibalizes its ability to contribute to the most stressful times of the grid. So the amount of firm capacity contribution, the amount of contribution that wind and solar are making to the grid during the most stressful times is not zero. It is contributing across all scenarios, but considering how much is being built, it's at a relatively low fraction relative to how much it's being built. Coal contributes different amounts. It's kind of follows the trends we've been discussing before. The model hangs on to coal in the current policy scenarios as a firm capacity resource. I do want to have a little caveat here, which is that we are not modeling things like the supply chain issues about how can you get low cost coal? Can you keep getting coal for your coal plant if you're only operating at a low capacity factor during certain times of the year? We don't model that scenario explicitly. There's just fixed coal prices. So there is a caveat here of whether or not the operating these coal plants at low capacity factors would actually be financially feasible for them, and we're not really capturing that particularly well in our modeling. Anyway, with that caveat being said, the model hangs on to it under current policies, but ditches uncontrolled coal for the most part in the decarbonization scenarios. Nuclear, fairly constant, a little bit gets built in the advanced nuclear case under decarbonization scenarios, but it's pretty constant. Storage, a lot gets built for firm capacity reasons. It has both an energy and a capacity value, so the model builds a fair amount of storage. CCS, natural gas CCS is the biggest firm capacity contributor here. You can see that it can be quite significant. The contribution of the natural gas with CCS technologies contributing to firm capacity in the decarbonization scenarios. Coal CCS does show up a little bit in the decarbonization scenarios. A lot of that is being retrofitting originally occurring under the 45V. Again, it's a very significant incentive for capturing carbon. So we see some retrofitting of that, and then the model chooses to hang on to that capacity, even when 45V requires, if you do have a decarbonization policy in place, chooses to hang on to that capacity. And then biopower plays a role, but a very small firm capacity contribution. Hydropower, fairly constant over time. Geothermal shows up a little bit, but kind of low and relatively stable across the suite. And then hydrogen, you can see this is much greater. Energy contribution, very little. It's a very expensive fuel to produce. However, it does play a pretty material role in providing firm capacity in the decarbonization scenarios. Again, just want to throw out this caveat that I mentioned earlier. The hydrogen that we are representing here is endogenously produced by the model through low temperature electrolysis. However, there is not a representation of the rather significant 45V production incentive for producing clean hydrogen. So we would expect that once we get that into the model, we would likely see hydrogen's role being even greater than what it is here with that rather significant incentive that's not currently in the model. Okay, handful more slides. So this is all stuff that you probably have a intuition for anyway, because it follows the generation trends as one would expect. But we're just going to show the range of national electricity sector CO2e emissions across the suite of scenarios. So this is only electricity sector for the US as a whole. It's not economy-wide emissions. And CO2, so it includes nitrous oxide and methane, but only from direct combustion. It's not including pre-combustion emissions, things like methane leakage and stuff like that, not in the figure that we're showing here. So this is the range of national electricity sector CO2e emissions over time. The last thing I want to call out here is that this red dotted line is the threshold by which, once this is passed, that's the trigger for when the IRA clean energy tax credits start phasing out. They don't go away immediately. There's both a phase out period, plus there's safe harbor provisions. So you tend to cross the line, and then it's at least several years before you start seeing a rebound in emissions. But anyway, so you can see across all scenarios, rapid near-term decline. A lot of that is the exiting of coal and rapid deployment of renewables. And then there's kind of a stabilization, often above the IRA threshold, where there may be a slight decline over time, but not nearly as rapid. So you've just reached that point where a lot of the transition has happened by 2030 in our model, and it's just a lot of new demand is being met by renewables predominantly, but kind of the total emissions of the grid as it continues to grow remains either constant or with slight decline. And then you do see some scenarios that pass the IRA threshold and then do see what can be significant rebounds when those clean generation tax credits go away. I'm going to take a moment to talk about the range of the present value of costs of the bulk costs of the power grid. So it's not all of the costs of building and operating the grid, it's only the bulk power system cost. So it's omitting things that are not within the REITs model, things like the distribution network administrative costs, like whatever the costs for metering and things like that aren't in here. It's just the cost of the bulk power system costs for building and operating the grid. It's the present value of those costs across the range of scenarios at a 1.7 social discount rate, inclusive of tax benefits. So we're saying that the PTC and stuff like that are decreasing these costs. You could draw the boundary different, represent those as a transfer. That would produce different numbers. Here, we're just drawing the boundary around the power sector and seeing those as a benefit. So given that, we do see a range under the current policy of the present value of the costs of building and operating the power sector across the range of scenarios. The biggest driver here is demand. The higher the demand growth, the more expensive the grid, although other things, of course, have an impact. One thing just to note is when we look here, the range of costs for the 95 by 2050 decarbonization scenario is, you can't even visually really see it, but like the mid case is only 0.5% higher than the present value cost of the mid case to achieve this decarbonization. The main reason is one, the current policy scenario gets most of the way. There's a significant decarbonization of the grid anyway. So the point at which that this trajectory actually becomes binding is really pretty late in our modeling, the 2040s. So both the point at which these costs start being greater than our current policy scenario happens both late, and then because there's pretty significant incentives for those kind of last years where the policy does become binding, the kind of extra costs to get to that extra decarbonization is relatively light. The cost to achieve the 100% decarbonization, both earlier and of course deeper decarbonization, is more material. This is, I think, a 14% increase in the mid-case cost to achieve this level of decarbonization. Okay, a couple more slides here. Okay, this is the last result slide. This is just interesting to see the amount of curtailment of variable renewable technologies. So how much wind and solar that is available, but we have tossed it away for operational reasons. You have too much, you can't back down your other generators enough, so you toss them away. Can be quite significant. This is in, the left is in terawatt hours per year across the different suite of scenarios, but a more intuitive number sometimes is the right number, which is how much of the variable renewable energy are we curtailing. So you can see here that, I mean, in the current policy scenarios, it often climbs above 10% of the wind and solar generation is being curtailed, and it can go even higher. The reason for that, of course, is that with the incentives, the significant production tax credit and then investment tax credit incentives for variable renewables, the amount of curtailment that you're willing to suffer as a renewable generator and still turn a profit or break even can be quite material. So you do end up as a product of just how competitive these things are in the incentivized environment. You do get this thing where the equilibrium, how much you're willing to accept of curtailment, can be pretty material, and the double digits percentages. So that's just interesting to see. A quick reminder, mentioned at this beginning, but you can download the report. There is a scenario viewer and data downloader, and then there's the Cambium database, which will be coming out later, that will embellish upon the metrics that you see here with more metrics and hourly resolution for a subset of the scenarios. You can find this stuff linked online, and I believe that it'll be linked in the Q&A section where you can find these things. I do want to very briefly just talk about what the Cambium data sets are, for those of you who might not be familiar. We're not going to go into them in detail, but just if you're not quite sure what I'm referring to there, I'm going to briefly talk about it. So the main thing is take a subset of the standard scenarios and run them through some production cost modeling, which produce more metrics that we don't get out of the standard scenarios modeling workflow. And at a higher temporal resolution, hourly, so you can see diurnal and seasonal trends of things like emissions, intensities, and things of that nature. So a standard scenario is really kind of this like overall high-level view, what's a narrative understanding of where the grid is going. The Cambium data is really supposed to be a lot more resolved and useful for plugging into other analyses to support other types of decision making. So standard scenarios, there is data, you can grab it. But really, that's kind of like a narrative, intuitive understanding where the grid is going. Cambium data sets are meant to support other types of analyses by producing things like longer marginal emission rate data that you can then plug into your data set. It's only a subset of scenarios, the ones that I'm showing here, 8 different scenarios. Kind of the main sensitivities plus 2 of the decarbonization scenarios are the ones that will be coming out for the standard scenario or Cambium 23 data sets. There's a bunch of different metrics. I'm not going to go on to all of them. I am just going to draw attention to the fact that the one that is probably the most useful or novel that you can't really get other places other than some individual states have these estimates, but as far as a comprehensive countrywide estimate for the future of the power sector, the long run marginal emission rate, which is an estimate of the either induced or avoided emissions from either added or avoided load added to the grid. We do have that metric in there. Taking the long run means we're taking into account induced structural change in that metric. Which, if you're not familiar with that, we have publications about that. If you're interested in the marginal emission space and unfamiliar with that concept, I recommend looking at a little bit of the stuff that we've published through the Cambium data sets talking about that. Okay, all right. That brings us to the end of the presentation. So hopefully some questions have been coming in on if you want to come off
Yes.
Yeah. Do you have questions coming in? Do you have anything that you were
Yeah.
want to raise up?
So there are quite a few questions here, and I'm just gonna kind of go over the ones on top of my list here. So the first question is basically about policies. So how this simulation and analysis will be helpful for policymakers. So maybe you can talk a little bit more about how policymakers can use this report.
Sure, great question. There's probably a lot of nuance there that I'm not going to be able to get to. I would say that first of all, if you're trying to study, or if you're trying to understand the effects of a policy that would affect the evolution of the power sector, there's probably not you're probably going to have to do your own modeling to really understand how that policy would affect the power sector. There's not like necessarily a way to cleanly and reliably intuit how it would affect the power sector just from this data set. However, you could look at our projections and say, is this particular portfolio standard, would it be met already by the assets that are being anticipated to be deployed for economic and policy reasons in the standard scenarios? If it is, then the policy, you could kind of intuit that it wouldn't do much. Or if you look and say, no, it wouldn't be met by the current suite, the current projection of what's being deployed in a region, then you could maybe know or guess how binding a particular policy would be. There are many other types of policies, things like if you're just looking at if your policy is something that's like a demand side policy that's meant to encourage electrification, and you have an estimate of how much electrification it would induce, the standard scenarios might be a little bit hard to divine useful conclusions from that, but we do have the Cambium data sets, which does have metrics that are meant to be helpful for that kind of policy, at least taking a first pass at those sorts of things. I could go on for a while. I'm just going to cut off here and saying that if you're thinking about doing a policy analysis and you think that standard scenarios or Cambium might be useful, but you're not quite sure how, reach out to us. We're happy to engage on that kind of stuff. We do have funding to support engagement with folks interpreting the data.
Great, thanks, Peter. So the second question it's about firm capacity, and can you talk a bit more about details on how firm capacity is calculated?
Yes, I probably should have talked a little bit about that when I introduced the notion. Firm capacity, the definitions in whatever the kind of state of the art, when you're talking about that, there's more of a stochastic treatment of whether or not a certain asset is going to be reliably available during the most stressful times on the grid. And REEDS is not a stochastic model, so we're not thinking about it in those terms. The actual definition that we use is given in the report. You can go and look it up when we're reporting firm capacity what it is. But the basic notion is that we are looking through 7 years of historical wind, solar, and load data. We're identifying, the model is identifying the time periods that it is, technically it's the times where the shadow price on the reserve margin constraint is the highest, which means those are the most difficult times for the model to meet the reserve margin requirement. Do we have enough assets to generators to meet demand? We look at the periods of time where that's the highest, and then we look at the contribution of different technology during those periods of time. That's how we are thinking about it when we are reporting these values in this particular study, just recognizing that, again, there are different ways, more sophisticated probabilistic methods of assessing generator contribution when that term is used in practice. So there's a little bit of a difference there.
Great. So the third question is a little bit about the IRA threshold not being met in the mid-K and current policy. So one person's asking if this insight will be kind of factor into the next ATB report, ATB data set.
Sure. So I think what the person is referring to is that I believe that in the ATB there's the technology ATB, the annual technology baseline that NREL puts out. It's a great resource spreadsheet you can go and download, and other data that has forecasted costs and performance for different technologies: wind, solar, natural gas, coal. I forget all the ones that are in there, but most of the technologies we have here are represented in the annual technology baseline. And I believe that at the bottom of those spreadsheets is a little thing that has like levelized cost of energy calculations based off of, and that they have a row for incentives, and I think that it probably has the incentives phasing out in 2032 for IRA. I don't actually know. Yeah, I guess good question whether or not based off of this, that kind of default will be expanded or by default extended out further in the next annual technology baseline. Full disclosure, haven't had any conversations internally about whether or not the ATB team would do that, but it's a great question that I will try to follow up on. Regardless, you can always just plug in kind of the intention of that levelized cost of energy area anyway is that you can modify those numbers and see how an extension of the tax credits would influence the levelized cost of energy of these technologies over time. So you can modify that with this knowledge regardless.
Great. There's one question about renewable energy curtailments, and one person is asking for you to explain a little bit more on why curtailment is so much lower in the 100% by 35
Yep,
scenario.
great question. So the blue scenarios that correspond to the 100% by 2035 decarbonization scenarios, as well as a handful of other ones, have this decline. What's going on there? The thing that's going on there is that in those scenarios, the IRA threshold is passed, tax credits phase away. So the again, that amount, the willingness that the model is, how much curtailment the model is willing to suffer in renewable energy builds to break even goes down a lot. So this kind of the difference here, this trend is a direct impact of the phase out of the IRA clean generation tax credits.
There are a few questions on transmission here, but one is, are transmissions bottleneck factor into probability?
Yeah, so great question. So I guess first of all, I'll just say we didn't really highlight transmission. There is a figure about transmission buildouts in the report. You can go and look that up. We didn't really highlight that this year. Mostly that's because there is a very large effort looking at transmission here at NREL going on in conjunction. I don't really know the timeline of the publications coming out of that. If you're interested in that area, I highly recommend you pay attention to the National Transmission Planning Study that will have a lot more deeper insights and whatever scenarios that are designed specifically look at those types of questions than what we would be able to do in the stand scenarios. So we didn't really dig into that this year. I will generally say that there are some constraints on the rate at which new transmission can be built. Forgive me, I'm forgetting whether or not it's just near-term constraints or if it's over the entire duration of the modeling horizon. It's mentioned in the report, and I'm forgetting right now which one it is. But it's not. There is some constraints on the rate at which we can build like this long distance transmission expansion. But we're not in this modeling, I would say, well representing, or at least directly representing things like kind of the near term, just difficulty of building transmission. It's sort of represented. The intention is these growth constraints are kind of a proxy for a bunch of phenomenon like that, but we're not explicitly representing like the whatever approvals process for transmission lines. That's a thing that is not directly represented in our modeling.
Okay. There's one questions about profitability, and so you mentioned that you didn't check if coal operations still remains profitable. So is that the same I mean, do you check on profitability for other technologies, especially renewables? And what is the internal rate of return looks like for solar in the model?
Yeah, sorry. So one thing I should clarify is that the model is assessing the least cost solution for everything that's represented within the modeling. So certainly wind and solar are, the model will build as much wind and solar up into the point at which it starts breaking even. The least cost system-wide solution is also what you would expect from an individual actor interacting with the market, if the market is functioning properly. So like that, within the costs that are represented with the modeling, that's a true statement. What I meant to convey with the whole statement is just that there are additional phenomenon that we're aware of, which is how operating coal, specifically at low capacity factors, has, at least in several instances, kind of exacerbated the ability of the coal to obtain whatever coal input, the fuel input, in competitive prices, and we're not modeling that type of phenomenon. So that's not obviously really relevant to wind and solar. And I guess any other phenomenon like that, that is a thing that that's not in the model. Yeah, I guess we're not modeling things that aren't in the model. Sorry. But for the most part, we try to represent the major things that are important, and these technologies are breaking even when they're being built according to that, the things that we're modeling. So hopefully that answers the question.
Yeah, so there are quite a few questions on storage, and so I kind of
Okay.
summarized a few of them. And so I guess the question is, maybe can you talk a little bit more about like the decisions just to include 4 and 8 hour batteries in the model?
Sure. Yeah, I guess so. Like in previous years, we had like 2-hour storage and 6-hour storage. We ended up getting rid of those partially just to kind of reduce the size of the model. That's probably the main justification for that. It didn't really change the overall narrative. Of course, you can have, storage durations of arbitrary duration. So it's not meant to say that 4 and 8 hour are the only things available. It was mostly just trying to simplify the decision space. You can of course have longer duration storage that we're not modeling here. When you start to talk about really long duration storage, it gets we're continuing to work on how to represent that in this capacity expansion modeling space. It is challenging to represent long duration storage. It is mostly at this point, you would think about that as represented by the hydrogen as a long duration storage option.
Yeah, okay. So the couple of questions just about the Cambium data set. And yeah, so the question is, does that have hourly weather, fuel price, and LMP? And also just like the date for the Cambiums this year to be available.
Yeah, date. Right. We are trying to get it out as soon as we can. There's always a lot of checking and stuff, and it's never entirely certain when we're going to be done with that. I hope to have it out within a month, but I wouldn't want to promise that to anyone. As far as the stuff that you just mentioned there, we have not traditionally output like hourly, fuel prices, and weather was the other thing that they asked about. Weather, we don't really have stuff that would be useful as an input. We have the wind and solar generation. We don't actually have the native weather. That's kind of much upstream in the model, and it's not in a way that's useful to other modeling teams. Sorry about that. A lot of people ask about that. We don't have weather stuff that we can easily hand you. And fuel prices, we haven't historically released those. We always might add them, but it takes time to add stuff. There's not current plans to do that this year. Yes, but LMPs, we do have the marginal cost of energy at the busbar level that is similar to an LMP. I want to be clear, it's a marginal cost, not a market price. So it tends to be less variation than what you see in marketplace because we're not capturing things like whatever market bidding strategies and behavior and stuff like that. But we do have the hourly marginal cost of electricity, of energy as well as capacity, which can serve a similar purpose if you're doing like a cost benefit analysis. Just recognize it's not exactly the same thing. It's not actually a price.
Right. We have a few more questions coming in. One question is about the assumption for reliability of grid. So, or one person asking, do you implement any constraints once you reach a certain penetrations of intermittent generations?
Yeah, so we do have, as far as so to be clear, we do not run, there are like purpose-built tools for assessing the reliability of a system. We do not run those as part of the expansion that's happening here. We do have essentially heuristics, like things that are often used in planning for assuring that a system is reliable. That is both the reserve margin, so you have to have at each point in time a certain amount more capacity available than the maximum demand, and then also in ancillary service products, reserve product and stuff like that are within the model. We also will we'll take the model and results and we will drop them into as generally part of the things that we do here at NREL. We'll both drop them into models that assess the resource adequacy of the systems that are being built by REITs, as well as things like putting them into Plexos and production cost models to see whether or not there's any dropped load. I will say that generally the systems that are being built here are in general very reliable systems. Usually we have maybe a very small amount of drop load where there is some type of failure of the heuristics that we use in these planning in the REITs model, that when you drop it into a model, you might see a particular region with a small amount of drop load. But if there ever is anything that rises to level where we think it's actually something that is undermining the results of the model, then we've spent a lot of time to make sure that we're improving the REITs model so it is building reliable systems. So overall, the systems here are being are reliable systems, and we do check with other tools, even though that's not actually part of the REITs modeling workflow.
Great. I think we have enough time for maybe 2 questions here, and there's one question about the RPS and whether or not we have that in the model. So I think the answer is yes, we do have that in the model.
Yes.
So the person also asking if we can talk a little bit more about the impact that have on capacity overall build out.
Yeah, sure. So very quickly, we have state level, both renewable portfolio standards and clean energy standards. We do our best to represent them as they're currently enacted. I say our best because sometimes there's really complicated rules about eligibility and trading and stuff like that we're not able to perfectly replicate in the model. But we have them represented. We have an estimate of the demand from them. If it's scheduled to increase over time, we have that represented. All that's in there. I will say that the model finds that most portfolio standards end up being non-binding just because of how much renewables we are expected to build under IRA. Most renewable portfolio standards, clean energy standards, are not binding. There are, of course, some states, like the ones that go to 100, that the policies do become binding, and you do see them having an effect on the build out. If you took them away, the build out would be slightly different. So there, we do our best to represent them, and in the most aggressive states they do have an influence. In other states, even if like the top line statement sounds really aggressive, sometimes it isn't enough to be more than what we're expecting to build for economic reasons alone.
Great.
Yeah, so I guess it looks like we're at time. Yeah, I don't know. Are there if you are available to continue reading off questions, we could go for another 5 minutes. If there are additional questions that you think it's worth doing that, obviously people are going to start dropping off. So if you're here and you're dropping off, thanks for your time. Do you think it's worth hanging around for another 5 minutes answering questions, or are we exhausting the questions?
I think we still have maybe 3 unanswered questions here, and there are a couple of questions about how to download data like curtailment. Is that available somewhere for us to download?
Yes. Yeah, forgive me. I can't remember actually whether or not we included the curtailment metric in this year's standard scenario download. If it's not in there, it is in the Cambium data sets. So that wouldn't be the full suite, but there is curtailment data that will be available for the types of futures we're modeling here. But you may have to go to Cambium when that comes out.
Okay, and I think there's one more question asking about the ITC and PTC of solar. Is there any assumptions made?
Yeah, there's assumptions. I'm going to just say that we have a description of how we're treating the Inflation Reduction Act. It's in the appendix of the report. I encourage you to go look at that. There's like bonus credits. We're making assumptions about what technologies are selecting which tax credit, and then make an assumption about the average capture of bonus credits. In reality, there's going to be more diversity than what we're modeling. It's all discussed in the report, so I'll point you there in the appendix of the report.
Okay, yes, I think that's great. And I think there's one more question on whether or not your slides will be available.
Yeah, I don't remember whether or not we make these available. Certainly the
recording will
the
be
recording,
made available.
yes,
Yeah,
the
on
recording will be
YouTube.
available. We may make the slides available in conjunction with that. I don't remember whether or not we usually go through the hoops for that. So
And then
apologies for
just,
not having an answer.
do you happen to have an email that people could go to or send any other follow-up questions?
Yeah, I should have that. Sorry, if there's a way for me to drop that into the Q&A. So it's just my name, peter.gagnon@nrel.gov. But
Send it in the chat.
yeah, but my name is spelled funny. So if you do, sorry, it's coming. If you whatever Google stuff about the standard scenarios or Cambia, my contact information is listed there. But it's also just Daniela just dropped it into the chat there. Feel free to reach out if you have additional questions. We're happy to engage both on what would make it useful, if there's clarifications, any stuff like that. Feel free to send us a note.
Yeah,
Okay.
I think it's just couple more questions on the links and stuff like that. So I can do that. I can just drop a few links directly in the Q&A.
Okay. All right. Recognizing that we're over time, I think we'll cut the verbal part here, and On can try to drop some links in there. So thank you for your time, everyone.